It's April 1980, and Zimbabwe has just gained independence from the repressive white minority Rhodesian government. This is, by all standards, a triumphant period for the Zimbabwean people inside and outside the country. 15 years of a bloody war of independence have resulted in the liberation of the Zimbabwean people from a white settler minority regime. But perhaps the biggest mistake on the part of the African liberation movements was that they organized themselves and fought this war along ethnic lines, resulting in the intensification of old pre-colonial ethnic tensions which had now taken a whole new political form. A mere 2 years after independence, there are reports of armed bandits and dissidents in one region of the country. Government responds by launching 2 attacks into that region. The first is an attack on the so-called dissidents. But the second is an attack on a rival political party together with its unarmed civilian supporters who also happen to be of a different ethnic group from most of the government. Between 1983 and 1987, an estimated 20,000 Zimbabwean people would be killed by a North Korean trained unit of the Zimbabwean army in an operation codenamed Gukurahundi. This is a story about the darkest chapter in the history of post-independence Zimbabwe. It's a story about politics, regionalism, and ethnic tensions. It's a story about how this man, Robert Mugabe, allegedly attempted a genocide on one of Zimbabwe's minority ethnic groups. To understand the Gukurahundi Massacres, it is important to first examine African nationalist politics in the then Southern Rhodesia. You see, before the Zimbabwean War of Independence, which is also known as the Rhodesian Bush War, there was one major nationalist movement in the territory, and that was the Zimbabwe African People's Union, or ZAPU. But in 1963, ZAPU had internal conflicts that led to the formation of a breakaway group that was called the Zimbabwean African National Union, or ZANU. ZAPU was mostly made up of the Ndebele ethnic group, and it was led by Joshua Nkomo, while ZANU, which was predominantly of the Shona ethnic group, was initially led by Ndabaningi Sithole, but subsequently taken over by Robert Mugabe. By the outbreak of the War of Independence in 1964, ZAPU and ZANU had established armed wings within their organizations. ZAPU had the Zimbabwe People's Revolutionary Army, or ZIPRA, which was trained by the Soviet Union, while ZANU had the Zimbabwe African National Liberation Army, or ZANLA, which was trained by the Chinese. From 1964 to 1979, these 2 rival African liberation movements waged a guerrilla campaign against the Rhodesian security forces. As such, the fighting was largely rural, as both ZIPRA and ZANLA tried to win the support of the peasant masses and to recruit fighters, while at the same time attacking the government and white civilians. Interesting enough, apart from fighting the Rhodesian security forces, ZIPRA and ZANLA were also known to fight each other on occasion, which was pretty ironic considering they had a common objective, which was to end white minority rule in their country. The war would ultimately end in a stalemate, resulting in a negotiated settlement at Lancaster House in 1979. In the elections that followed in April 1980, ZANU won 57 out of the 100 seats, while ZAPU won 20 seats. The white Rhodesians had 20 seats reserved for them as part of the Lancaster House Agreement. All of these seats were won by Ian Smith's Rhodesian Front. The remaining 3 seats were won by a smaller party known as the UANC, led by one Bishop Muzorewa. With ZANU's victory in the elections, Robert Mugabe became Prime Minister and later President, while Joshua Nkomo of ZAPU was appointed Home Affairs Minister. With white minority rule effectively defeated in Zimbabwe, the stage was now set for the political and ethnic rivalry between ZANU and ZAPU to play out. As the new Prime Minister, Robert Mugabe was faced with the challenge of integrating both ZIPRA and ZANLA guerrillas into the national military. These guerrillas, or more accurately, liberation fighters, were placed in assembly points all over the country where they were to remain until the British military training team could give them proper training. Integration into the National Army was very slow coming, and a lot of these soldiers, many of them quite young, were beginning to lose their patience. The inactivity in the assembly points led to intrusive thoughts, and soon enough, some elements within both ZIPRA and ZANLA were reported to be terrorizing civilian populations. As a response, government moved some of the soldiers from the assembly points to Chitungwiza and Entumbani. This hardly helped the situation as the ZIPRA and ZANLA soldiers began to fight one another. These fights were generally caused by tribalism and ill treatment of the ZIPRA guys by those of ZANLA. You see, many ZANLA soldiers, and indeed their ZANU politicians, tended to think that their electoral victory in 1980 was tantamount to winning the War of Liberation. They also began to view ZIPRA soldiers and their ZAPU leaders as losers in the liberation of Zimbabwe. It also didn't help that some senior ZANU politicians like Enos Nkala went about spreading dangerous hate speech against ZAPU. In November 1980, for example, Nkala went to a rally in Bulawayo where he made remarks attacking ZAPU leaders like Joshua Nkomo, as well as making threats that ZANU would soon deliver devastating blows to ZAPU. This, of course, did not go well with the Ndebele people who were ZAPU supporters. A full-scale battle later ensued at Entumbani between ZIPRA and the National Army, much of which was made up of integrated ZANLA soldiers. In early 1981, Robert Mugabe demoted ZAPU leader Joshua Nkomo from the high-profile position of Minister of Home Affairs. Nkomo would spend the whole year in government as minister without portfolio. This only served to antagonize ZAPU some more, and in February of the same year, another fight broke out between the National Army and ZIPRA soldiers at Entumbani. At this point, even the ZIPRA soldiers who had already been integrated into the National Army don't want to be there anymore. The harassment, low prospects for promotion, and constant fear for their lives leads some of them to desert the military and to go into the bush as dissidents. In February 1982, the government claimed to have discovered arms caches that supposedly belonged to ZIPRA. ZAPU leaders like Joshua Nkomo and 3 others were fired from cabinet and accused of plotting to overthrow the government. 2 of ZIPRA's high-ranking men, Dumiso Dabengwa and Lookout Masuku, were also implicated in the treason charges. These charges were bogus and were likely an attempt by ZANU to get rid of ZAPU. First of all, it should be borne in mind that just 3 years prior, ZANU and ZAPU, or more accurately, ZANLA and ZIPRA, had fought a guerrilla war against the Rhodesian security forces. It was not uncommon for liberation armies to stash weapons in the bush, often without the knowledge of their senior party leaders. As a result of the persecution of their political and military leaders, some ZIPRA men from within the National Army deserted and became dissidents. The dissidents engaged in a variety of crimes like attacking trains, private vehicles, abducting Europeans, and attacking government installations and equipment. Despite all of this, Joshua Nkomo continuously denounced dissident activities and discouraged other ZIPRA men from leaving the military. However, this was a little too late, and his words fell on deaf ears. Back in 1980, after independence, Robert Mugabe had signed an agreement with North Korean leader Kim Il-sung to have the North Korean military train a unit within the Zimbabwean army. The North Koreans arrived in Zimbabwe in August of 1981 and began training this unit, which was called the 5th Brigade. Although there had been some ZIPRA men in the 5th Brigade, they were slowly discarded, such that by the end of training in 1982, the unit comprised ZANLA men only. Another interesting thing about the 5th Brigade was that it didn't fall under any of the Zimbabwean army command structures, but rather reported directly to Robert Mugabe. In January 1983, Mugabe launched Operation Gukurahundi, which was to be effected by the 4,000-strong North Korean-trained 5th Brigade. The objective? To put an end to all dissident activity in Matabeleland, which was the stronghold of ZAPU and its armed wing, ZIPRA. At the heart of the Gukurahundi operation was a strategy of state-sanctioned terror, not only targeting the dissidents, but also the ZAPU officials, former ZIPRA men, and innocent Ndebele victims. You see, Robert Mugabe had now decided that ZAPU must be destroyed, but to fully destroy it also meant crushing its support base. From the onset of Operation Gukurahundi, it became clear that the negligible number of dissidents were not the primary target of the 5th Brigade. Although targets did include ZAPU officials and ZIPRA soldiers, the larger portion of the targets happened to be the non-combatant civilian population of Matabeleland and the Midlands, who belonged to the minority Ndebele ethnic group. Between 1983 and 1984, the 5th Brigade wreaked havoc in Matabeleland North and South. Every Ndebele man of fighting age was considered a potential dissident and therefore guilty one way or another. A lot of them received severe beatings, while some were executed. There were public executions, often after the victims were forced to dig their own graves. Other times, the 5th Brigade massacred large groups of the Ndebele at once. In March 1983, for example, 62 young men were shot on the banks of a river in Lupani. 7 of them survived with gunshot wounds, while 55 of them died. Other people were burnt alive in their huts, while others were raped and publicly humiliated. Another form of torture was gathering large numbers of Ndebele people and forcing them to sing in the Shona language, praising ZANU and Robert Mugabe while being beaten at the same time. It is believed that within the first 28 days of the Gukurahundi operation, the 5th Brigade, with their distinctive red berets and camouflage, had eliminated between 3,000 and 5,000 Ndebele civilians. There are varying estimates as to how many civilians were massacred during the Gukurahundi operation. While the general consensus puts the toll at no less than 10,000 and no more than 20,000, there are claims that the number might actually be as high as 50,000. Operation Gukurahundi officially came to an end in December 1987 when Robert Mugabe and Joshua Nkomo signed the Unity Accord. In April 1988, Mugabe announced an amnesty for all dissidents, while Nkomo also called upon them to lay down their arms and surrender. To facilitate this, an ordinance was released basically stating that those who surrendered by May 31, 1988 will be given immunity or a full pardon. A total of 122 dissidents gave themselves up, and a few weeks later, the immunity was extended to all members of the 5th Brigade who had committed human rights violations. Gukurahundi is a colloquial term in the Shona language, which means the early rain that washes away the chaff before the summer rains. Now, this was not a new word in the political history of Zimbabwe. The term was used by ZANU in 1963 and again in 1979. It was a political strategy, a strategy of annihilation. So, naming the 1983 Operation Gukurahundi was very symbolic. It not only justified the cleaning out of dirt, but also showed how the lives and bodies of the Ndebele people were reduced to mere chaff, which had to be washed away by the early rains. This is why many people have claimed that Operation Gukurahundi was a Ndebele genocide. What is clear, however, is that ZANU, and more specifically Robert Mugabe, wanted to get rid of all political opposition in Zimbabwe and create a one-party state. ZAPU and ZIPRA had to be destroyed, but more importantly, the civilians in Matabeleland and the Midlands who were ZAPU supporters and therefore its lifeline had to be neutralized as well. So, using the Gukurahundi analogy, we can conclude by saying that soon after independence, the cleansing rain in the form of the 5th Brigade was unleashed by ZANU upon ZAPU, ZIPRA, and the civilian population of Matabeleland and the Midlands in an attempt to create a one-party state in Zimbabwe. Don't forget to share and like the video if you've enjoyed it. This has been Simon Bayani with Africa in Retrospect. Until next time, cheers for now.